Everybody's looking at my tight pants. I got my tight pants. I got my tight pants on.
Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from The Bunker. In this video, I will be sharing my thoughts on the February 2019 JW Broadcasting episode, which is hosted by Tony Morris. So without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
The theme of this program is taken from the second part of Romans 12:10. In showing honor to one another, take the lead. What is honor? In the Hebrew scriptures, the term translated honor literally means heaviness. So when we honor someone, we're acknowledging that he's weighty or that he amounts to something.
We've barely begun and already this is shaping up to be a fairly typical JW Broadcasting episode. The definition of a rudimentary word that everyone is familiar with is being explained.
Whom should we honor? Of course, Jehovah is worthy of honor. How do we give him honor? There are many ways. We honor him by doing his will, obeying his laws and principles. We honor him by extolling his qualities and promises, telling others about these gifts from God. We show him honor by contributing financially to the worldwide educational work that he's directing through his Son and Holy Spirit.
Yes, what a surprise. It turns out one of the main ways of honoring God is by giving money to Watchtower.
1 Timothy 5, verse 17 urges us to give elders double honor because of their hard work in our behalf. Romans 13, 1 and 7 even extends the matter of showing honor to governmental rulers and others in authority.
So as someone who for a brief time served as an elder, take it from me, elders are not automatically deserving of honor. I think that respect is something that should be earned, and you don't just demand honor or demand respect just because of the position you're in. We have examples of elders who have gone above and beyond in making people's lives miserable, whether through their draconian stance judicially and getting people disfellowshipped or through their mishandling of abuse. I think it's always a mistake to single out a group of people in a hierarchy and say, these are people who you should honor. But there's also some hypocrisy in this brief clip because it's talking about how you should honor the superior authorities. Well, that's not something that we see Watchtower doing. Certainly in the case of child sex abuse mishandling, the Australian Royal Commission was something of a train wreck in terms of Watchtower's inability to accept fairly straightforward and reasonable suggestions for reform. We've seen time after time Watchtower act in a very underhanded way with the legal system, refusing court orders, etc. So it's another case of Watchtower saying to Jehovah's Witnesses, effectively, do as we say, not as we do.
Marriages in general today are seriously lacking in honor. Marriage mates often demean one another with harsh words and disrespectful attitudes. Some in the world resort to physical violence as if that somehow makes the abusive one right in his view of what the issue is. And infidelity on the part of one or both mates is so common, it doesn't even raise eyebrows anymore. All of this is a gross lack of honor in marriage. But what about marriages of those professing to be Jehovah's Witnesses? We're blessed with so many marriages that are wholesome and honorable. True, none are perfect. But how blessed we are to have the truth and to have learned to be more and more Christ-like with each other.
The impression is very clearly given that if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're more likely to have a happy marriage. You're more likely to deal in a good way with your spouse. I think that there are numerous examples. If you speak to ex-witnesses, particularly ex-witnesses who are victims of domestic violence, it quickly becomes clear that being a Jehovah's Witness does not in any way guarantee that you will be a respectful spouse. And in fact, we get a clue as to why that is in Tony Morris's reference to domestic violence. He makes the remark that in many cases, in non-Jehovah's Witness or worldly marriages, things escalate to violence. And this is actually one of several times during the broadcast that Tony Morris specifically refers to the possibility of marriage mates being physically abusive. And in none of those instances of him raising that issue does he make it clear that someone in that situation ought to get out of the relationship or seek help, or they shouldn't feel as though they need to stay with an abusive spouse. This is one of one of a number of opportunities in this broadcast for him to make that very clear, but he's not going to make it clear because he believes and teaches, and Watchtower teaches, that once you get married, the only way out of a marriage is adultery. So as far as Jehovah's Witnesses are concerned, a husband could be beating his wife black and blue, and the best the wife can hope for is a separation, meaning that she can never move on and have a relationship with anyone else. It's one of the most dangerous policies that Jehovah's Witnesses have. It's not expressly referred to in this episode, but what is repeatedly referred to is the concept, shall we say, of spouses being violently abusive. And again, none of these opportunities are taken to tell victims of domestic violence that they don't have to put up with that kind of treatment.
While relatively few of our marriages end up with some kind of physical violence and relatively few end up in divorce, what about having honor in the marriage? After living together as husband and wife for many months or for years or even for decades, familiarity can cause us to treat each other with less respect or honor than when we were courting. That isn't right. It isn't Christ-like.
So again, one of a number of occasions where he references domestic violence without giving the proper advice, that you don't have to tolerate that situation. But that part at the end is interesting, where he says it isn't right, it isn't Christ-like. It's one of many points during this broadcast where you can see indignation in Tony Morris. And I think that this is a characteristic of his appearances on camera and his appearances on the podium. He loves to get indignant and show his indignation on a given subject. And in my view, it projects a certain arrogance, as if to say, I would never do this. How dare any of you be doing this? That's how it comes across to me. And you see it again at multiple points during this broadcast. I'm not going to show you all of them. You'd have to watch the whole thing, but it just strikes me as intriguing and rather disappointing, given the fact that there's so much about him and his colleagues and their teachings and policies about which indignation is fully justified, especially when it comes to the abusive practices, the shunning, the covering up of abuse, persuading people to die rather than accept blood transfusions. I could give him, and many people could give him, quite a good strong dose of indignation, but he seems to have plenty of it for those who he is addressing, who he quite clearly seems to be looking down on.
The role of the husbands clearly stated at 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3. And while some wives in society may bristle at this thought, wives serving Jehovah are to embrace this thought. It's the arrangement of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3 says, "But I want you to know that the head of every man is the Christ, in turn the head of a woman is the man, in turn the head of the Christ is God." God's word says that the head of a woman is the man. However, the head of the woman is not to be a domineering man, not an abusive man verbally or physically. The January 15th, 2015 issue of the Watchtower said this: "Remember that marriage is not a competition to find out who is stronger, who can shout louder, or who can think of the most cutting remark. True, we all have flaws, and sometimes we upset others. But there is never a justifiable reason for either a husband or a wife to use sarcastic and demeaning speech, or worse, to shove or hit each other. How can we change the atmosphere? Someone needs to put out the fire with the water of God's word."
So I'm sure you noticed those comments toward the beginning of this selection of clips I've just shown, where he says some worldly wives may bristle at this thought of men being in subjection. Yes, rightly so, because it's misogynistic. It is saying that if you don't have the correct genitals, then you are slightly less of a person. You don't have the same honor. You don't have the same power in a relationship. So it's right that in the 21st century we should be bristling at that sort of language. But this is the thinking that pervades the Jehovah's Witness organization, where women are very much second-class citizens. And when you have this imbalance, when you have one group put over another group, not based on how good they are as people, not based on their positive attributes, but based purely on their gender, it creates a perfect storm for corruption and abuse. And again, anyone who spends time speaking to ex-witnesses who have survived domestic violence situations, obviously in cases where it's the husband who's violent, quite often it's this idea of the woman being in subjection that has been a major part of perpetuating that abuse. But I also find it interesting that, again, Tony Morris is referencing, actual domestic violence and a husband or wife hitting their spouse by quoting this Watchtower article. And again, nowhere, you cannot mention this without, in my view, without saying, here's what would need to happen in that situation. An abused husband or wife should not have to endure that kind of situation. They have every right to consult the authorities. They have every right to seek support from society. And, they can't be expected to stay tied to such a toxic individual. Again, you're not going to see that advice because it runs counter to what Watchtower believes or teaches. But in many ways, this advice that's given here in this Watchtower quote about husbands and wives directly dealing with domestic violence is similar to the advice you get about child sex abuse. Watchtower just seems to think it's fine and their job is done if they just say, here's something that's terrible, don't do it. Child sex abuse is a crime, we abhor it, don't do it. Domestic violence, shoving or hitting your husband or wife, we don't approve of it, don't do it. Nowhere is there what happens next. Nowhere do they explain that when that does happen, as it inevitably will, here's how we deal with the problem so that the situation doesn't get worse. Because Watchtower just seems to think that by, you see at the end there where Tony Morris is waving his Bible, Watchtower just seems to think that the Bible is the solution to everything, and particularly their interpretation of the Bible and their writings about the Bible are the solution to everything. This is a very, very naive approach, because some people are just violent, some people are psychopaths, some people are child molesters, and no amount of waving the Bible around is going to fix that. So I feel that in microcosm, this Watchtower quote that's shown on the screen highlights one of the main problems with Watchtower's entire approach to abuse, is that they seem to think that they can just tell people to stop being abusive, when it quite clearly doesn't work that way.
One day, as I was walking and holding the little girl's hand, I saw Filuca's husband walking toward me. My heart stopped, and I said to myself, "He's going to hit me." But Emil was a gentleman, and he took the little girl in his arms, talked to her for a few minutes, and then he put her back down and left. When I saw him leaving, I thanked Jehovah because he didn't beat me.
In 1990, I looked for my wife, and I told her that I would like to remarry her, to reunite our family.
So this is a bit of an odd segment, and I've shown you the oddest part of the odd segment, because it's talking about a lady in Romania who was called on by the older lady who you've just seen, who's a Jehovah's Witness, and ended up becoming a Jehovah's Witness, even though her husband, who clearly wasn't a Jehovah's Witness, disapproved and said, well, if you go ahead and join, I'm going to divorce you. And sure enough, he ends up divorcing her. And they have this very sad situation where they have children and, you know, they're living apart, and it's all very sad. But surprise, surprise, the guy ends up, you know, reuniting with his wife and becoming a Jehovah's Witness, and in fact an elder. So that's the kind of happily ever after at the end of this segment. But this bit here was odd. The older lady who was responsible for this couple becoming witnesses describes walking down the street when the guy's coming to her, and she thinks he's going to hit her, even though she knows he's a gentle person. And when, predictably, he doesn't hit her and instead picks up the child and, you know, moves along and everything's fine, she thanks Jehovah. And I just think, well, what is there to thank? I mean, you're panicking about something that was unlikely to happen and didn't happen, and you're crediting Jehovah with the fact that this didn't happen. I just found it to be quite odd, and perfectly in keeping with the sorts of mundane things that you see in these JW Broadcasting episodes that end up being attributed to Jehovah or Jehovah's hand.
How do we show honor to one another? One way is well described at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23 and verse 24. We show honor when we put the other person's feelings and needs ahead of our own. Let each one keep seeking not his own advantage, but that of the other person. We show honor when we suppress our own rights. What we do or say might be lawful, but is it advantageous? Will it build up? Verse 24 then concisely says it. Keep seeking not our own advantage or right, but that of the other person.
So there's two things I wanted to say here. First of all, I think that this is quite malignant advice and ideology, and you see it repeated a lot in Watchtower propaganda, this idea of foregoing your rights. This may be your right, but you should really think about the other person. And what they usually mean when they say that is, you should really think about what's best for Watchtower. You know, never mind what your personal rights are. That's the first thing. The other thing is, I find it quite hypocritical for them to be talking about putting others first when you have a situation where Watchtower is entirely seeking its own needs and its own advantage over the welfare of children when it comes to how accusations of abuse are handled. Time after time, you see examples of reports of abuse just being sat on because the organization is terrified of its reputation being maligned, of Jehovah's name, of reproach being brought on Jehovah's name. They don't stop to think about the needs of the victims, and they don't stop to think about the urgent need to prevent more victims. And in this particular verse that's read in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 23 and 24, it says, all things are lawful, but not all things are advantageous. It may not be lawful or legally required in a number of states and countries for child abuse to be reported. One example is the United Kingdom. There isn't mandatory reporting yet of child sex abuse in the United Kingdom. But just because you are legally not required to report abuse, that doesn't mean that it isn't extremely urgent that abuse is reported to stop further victims from accumulating. So I really wish Watchtower would apply this scripture in its own approach to child abuse, because we saw in the May 2019 Watchtower how they are re-emphasizing this thought that, oh well, if the local laws tell us to report abuse, then we will. Obviously meaning that if the laws aren't in place, they're not going to report abuse. We've seen in instance after instance child sex abuse not being reported, even though the laws required it, as was the case in Montana, where Watchtower lost a $35 million lawsuit. But I just wish that they would take this verse to heart when it comes to the urgent need to do the right thing. Not necessarily what's legally required, but what's morally and ethically required, namely to make sure that all accusations of abuse are dealt with immediately by the authorities.
Earlier, I cited 1 Timothy 5:17, where we're urged to give elders double honor because of their hard work in our behalf. They're also part of our congregation and deserve honor. In our August program last year, Brother Lett helped us consider much of what is involved. You'll recall that his subject was appreciating our gifts in men.
Yes, I do remember the August program. I remember it very well. In fact, part of it made its way into my 10 worst JW broadcasting moments of all time, because it included the ridiculous 2-inch paintbrush analogy that Stephen Lett gave, where the basic point of the analogy was to tell Jehovah's Witnesses that they should do whatever the elders tell them to do, whether it makes sense or not. Even if the elders, for example, told witnesses that they should paint their kingdom hall using only 2-inch paintbrushes, this is something that they should just go ahead and do, because that's what the elders say and the elders know best. And we had the infamous magazine article telling witnesses that they should obey elders even if what they are told to do doesn't make sense from a human standpoint. That wording was actually put in print, and Watchtower is evidently proud of it because they referred to it again in the 2018 Be Courageous convention. Yeah, I do remember that speech by Stephen Lett very well, and I don't think it's something that Tony Morris should be pleased about. But it's also interesting that in these broadcasting episodes you have governing, and we've seen it before, where you have governing body episodes being referred to as though they are almost akin to scripture. You know, it's one thing to say, in this Watchtower article it said this, or in this publication it said that. But now the governing body are just so used to being viewed as these kind of gurus and spiritual leaders that it's just a case of name dropping governing body members now. Oh, in Brother Let's Talk, blah, blah, blah. This, I'm sorry, this just did not happen when I was a Jehovah's Witness and when I was growing up as a Jehovah's Witness. I didn't really know who the governing body members were. I'd maybe recognize one or two of the faces from the occasional appearances in the publications of say, group mugshots. But it's now reached the point where these men view themselves as so important that they are reeling off names and JW Broadcasting episode numbers the same way they would reel off scriptures.
Ever since Aki left, things have been off between Kara and I.
So this was a dramatization, the point of which is to show a Jehovah's Witness husband and wife who are going through marriage problems, and it shows how they eventually resolve these problems by being super duper Jehovah's Witnesses, as you would expect. But I just found it fascinating that when it's showing, I mean, obviously it's like a before and after narrative, and when it's showing before, when it's showing the relationship at its most deteriorated, where there's friction and where the husband and wife aren't getting on, it's mostly the wife who's being nasty and being short and just being unpleasant to be around. It doesn't seem, there doesn't seem to be anything that the husband's doing, and I just find that rather intriguing. It's almost as though the script for this video were written by a man. But yeah, it just seems to be typical of the kind of male-centric propaganda that Watchtower puts out. Again, it seems to be all on the woman in this scenario. When you see him on the sofa at the beginning, there's just been an episode where she's tried to sit down while he's watching a game and try to have a conversation, and because he's distracted by the game, they don't have a conversation, and she gets annoyed. And quite frankly, I don't think I'm the worst husband in the world, but if I'm watching Man United on the telly and Diana sits next to me and tries to get into a deep conversation about life and about marriage and what have you, a similar thing is going to happen, I'm afraid. But yeah, I just think it's very unfair the way the wife is portrayed as being the bad person in this scenario. And again, it's typical of the sort of misogynistic slant of this sort of video propaganda.
We thought about Abraham and Sarah. They weren't perfect.
That's kind of an understatement. Not only was Abraham imperfect, he also, we're told, almost killed his son after hearing voices in his head.
Later, we decided to pioneer together. Now, it seemed we had a lot to talk about.
I felt like I was seeing a whole new side of Kiara.
So yes, this is the happily ever after. This couple managed to put their differences aside and frolic around in a feel-good part of the segment in which they're flirting with each other and playing Jenga and going out on their bikes and throwing popcorn at each other and that kind of thing. And then you have this touching, romantic suggestion, which, let's face it, is going to fix any marriage. Honey, I think we should spice up our relationship. I think we should pioneer together.
Like Abraham and Sarah, our marriage wasn't perfect. There's going to be stressful times.
Presumably, unlike Abraham and Sarah, the husband didn't end up fathering a child with his wife's handmaid.
We have a special treat. A longtime faithful couple has joined us in the studio, William and Angela Samuelson, who serve at Patterson Bethel in the United States.
When Angie was upset with me about something, could have been anything, but in the conversation, it obviously showed in her tone of voice.
Mm-hmm.
So I explained to her that she could say anything she wanted as long as she smiled when she said it. Well, she tried, and we both had a good laugh.
It's very hard to stay mad when you're smiling.
Smiling, very, very good advice.
She never complained, nor did she become unduly inquisitive about my assignment, which sometimes would have been confidential.
Mm-hmm.
When we had an unexpected move that came up, a change of assignment somewhere, Angie would just pack and be ready to go.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That was my job, packing.
So this was another one of those interviews where, rather than interviewing ordinary people from the congregations who aren't necessarily in, serving in Bethel, doing important work for Watchtower, they play it safe and they stick with Bethelites and people who've been in the organization for decades. And they pick William and Angela Samuelson. And I found that the elephant in the room throughout this whole interview was a very obvious disparity in importance in the relationship between the husband and the wife. It's almost as though the wife has some kind of childlike status in the relationship where she has to smile when she's, saying something negative to her husband, or she has to content herself with, just being able to uproot and go wherever her husband is assigned and not complain about it, and it's her job to pack, and just almost kind of celebrating how subservient Angie is. It's obviously fairly typical for a Jehovah's Witness marriage, particularly a Jehovah's Witness marriage where they've been in the organization for decades and they have worked their way up the ladder with the organization. But it's untypical in modern society where women aren't just treated like chattel, aren't just expected to be their husband's sidekick and follow him around wherever he goes and not have an equal say in what happens. So quite an interesting little interview.
When my second daughter was born, one night she just stopped breathing. And a few minutes later, the nurse came out and said, God wanted a flower for his garden, and that's where your daughter's gone. So at that moment of time, I was very angry, and I feel sad and sorrow and lonely. And I have the horrible guilt. It's my fault. Or it's God, it's his fault. So I stopped praying to God. One day, there was one very kind lady come to knock on my door. And then eventually one day the ladies stopped me and have a conversation. And the conversation lead to why people die and what happened when they're dead. Knowing it's nobody's fault, it's just our imperfection. I found it a great relief. God did not punish me for that. And from then on, I started a Bible study with her.
So we're now watching a testimony from a Jehovah's Witness lady from the UK who is recounting how she ended up becoming a Jehovah's Witness after getting into essentially an arranged marriage and moving to the UK with her husband and encountering the witnesses. And Well, there's two things that kind of hit me with that story that she's just told about losing her baby. She's gone from one religion or one, one religion, albeit the religion of someone at the hospital, giving her bad advice. Oh, your child is, God wanted another flower in heaven, which is just awful, awful advice to be giving to a grieving parent. And she's gone from one bad idea to another bad idea or set of bad ideas with Jehovah's Witnesses, namely, everyone on the planet who doesn't agree with our beliefs deserves to die, and that's how we'll get rid of evil. We're going to fix evil by murdering everyone who doesn't agree with us. From one terrible, terrible idea to even more, you could argue, terrible ideas. But it also underscores for me the modus operandi of cults and especially Jehovah's Witnesses, namely that it's easy to recruit people into these organizations. I mean, you often hear from people who've never been witnesses, who are just amazed at some of the things that you're required to believe as a Jehovah's Witness, and some of the sacrifices you make, and some of the prohibitions and what have you. And they're like, well, how could you ever have believed that to begin with? And when you get out of the organization, you go through almost a period of self-loathing, at least in my experience, where you almost hate yourself for being so gullible to believe it all. Well, first of all, you can't really blame people who are raised in the group whose very first memories are, this is the truth, this is what you have to believe, coming from your parents as well, who you trust. You can't blame people who are introduced to these ideas from childhood. But even people who weren't born into the organization, as we see here, someone who was essentially preyed upon at a very vulnerable moment in her life. An emotionally traumatic experience that she had was leveraged so that the organization could get its claws on her. Oh, well, this terrible thing has happened to you, but don't worry, we've got answers and we've got solutions, because maybe you will get to see your child again in the resurrection. So that's how cults do so well. They find people when they are at their lowest, and they exploit their trauma.
My husband shouted at me. Often he gave me a hard time because I want to take all my children to the meeting. One day he wanted me to choose between him or Jehovah. And I prayed to Jehovah. I said, Jehovah, now's the time. I need your Holy Spirit to help me. And I said, my husband is a good man, and he deserves to know why I chose my life. And I just feel so calm. And then I turn around and I ask my husband, what do you think of me since I've become a witness? Am I a better wife, or am I getting worse? So my husband said, oh, okay then, if that was the case, go serve your God Jehovah.
So we see this narrative represented again and again in Watchtower materials. We saw it in the outrageous December 2018 Watchtower, which was encouraging women in abusive relationships to endure so that they could, win their husband over without a word. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Albeit this isn't a fictitious story, by all accounts this actually happened, but it's the same sort of thinking that Watchtower is appealing to, namely telling, and I'm not suggesting in any way that this woman's husband was being abusive, but again, it's the same principle of, you need to win your husband over without a word. You need to show your husband that you are a good wife because of your religion, because it would be impossible to be a good wife without being a Jehovah's Witness. So you need to sell the religion to him by being the best wife you can be. The December 2018 Watchtower again takes it even further, by saying even if he's being physically abusive to you, you should pursue this idea of trying to recruit him and stick it out and endure. That's basically the idea here, for women to be used as a recruitment tool. And I'm sorry, it just doesn't make logical sense that you join a religion because your wife has improved in her behavior since joining. I'm sorry, you join a religion because it's true. You join a religion because you are convinced that its beliefs, its theology, its claims about the universe, all of those things are true. You do not join a religion because your wife is a better wife since joining. That's just an awful reason to join a religion, because quite clearly you don't need to be a Jehovah's Witness to be a good wife.
One of my Bible students come up to my house and she was crying because she suffered persecution from her husband. And my husband was sit next to me, and then he turned around and said, "You just have to persevere, because my wife went through the same experience and look where she is now." The last 10 years, my husband come to all the meeting with me. Seeing my children happy is the most important thing for me. And they not only happy for a short time, but they also have a happy future. My life now, I'm no longer lonely. I'm no longer fatherless child, because I know Jehovah care for me. Jehovah help a little woman like me. And I'm sure Jehovah will help anybody who has towards him.
Sister Lee's example helps us to see that even in spiritually divided homes, applying Bible principles in our life can often soften the heart of our mate toward the truth.
No, Tony, Sister Lee's story is yet another example of your organization putting women in abusive situations. Because we've just heard there Sister Lee talk about her Bible study come to the house with a report of being persecuted by her husband. And to be fair, we don't know what form this persecution took. We don't know whether it was verbal abuse or physical abuse or both. But the advice that's given is the same advice that we see in that awful December 2018 Watchtower. Oh, just stick it out. Persevere. Because the main objective is to win the husband over without a word. That's what comes first. Bear in mind, in this very JW Broadcasting episode, we've heard Watchtower talking about the need to put other people's interests ahead of your own interests. So Watchtower should be putting the needs of women, the needs of people in abusive relationships over their own needs. But instead, Watchtower is taking these situations and saying, how can we benefit from this? What's in it for us? How do we maximize the potential from this situation? What we need to do is we need to tell an abused woman with a husband who isn't a Jehovah's Witness to stick it out with the abuse, stick it out with the persecution, because that's our best shot of doubling the membership statistics in that particular household. We want him to join, so we'll tell the woman to stick it out. That is literally the approach that Watchtower takes in that situation.
But what about ones outside the congregation? Do we show honor to them as well? Of course. Galatians 6:10 tells us, as long as we have the opportunity, let us work what is good toward all. The best way we can do this is by helping them cultivate and satisfy their spiritual needs.
I've put up with a lot of this individual's arrogance and ignorance and hypocrisy, and this for me is one of the clearest examples. You may be wondering why. Well, it's because he's talking about honoring people who aren't in the congregation. In other words, people who aren't Jehovah's Witnesses. He's saying, of course we honor them. We honor them by trying to make it so that they're not non-Jehovah's Witnesses. We do it by trying to change who they are so that they will be like us. That's not honoring someone. You don't honor someone by saying, you have worth as an individual if you become like me. That's not true honor. True honor is honoring someone for how they are. So how on earth can Toni Morris say, oh, well, we honor them by trying to recruit them into our organization? That is not honor. That's exploitation. And quite frankly, you can say a lot of things about Jehovah's Witnesses and their approach to outsiders, but one thing you cannot say is that there is any respect at all shown to non-Jehovah's Witnesses when the entire theology is predicated on everybody who isn't in the religion being worthy of slaughter if Armageddon were to come tomorrow. And I'm sorry, if you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, I'm just telling it like it is. You go to bed every night and you pray for something to happen, Armageddon, that will lead to the slaughter of everybody you know who isn't one of Jehovah's Witnesses. How is that showing honor to your neighbor, your workmate, to the other parents at your kid's school? There's no honor there. You are willing for these people to die. You have to. It's in your religion.
August 21st, 2017 has been on a lot of people's calendars for a long time because of the total eclipse.
As Jehovah's Witnesses, we are constantly on the lookout for events where we can support community outreach. Brothers and sisters prepared well in advance to give a Bible education to the many travelers.
What convinced us that this was an opportunity to give a great witness was we did a little research, and we noticed the hotel bookings, the town was packed. So we could tell this was going to be a big event. We needed to do something.
We wanted to be in a position to share the wonderful things from the Bible with them.
This was just a bizarre segment. What we have here is a congregation in a town in Oregon figuring out that their town is going to get inundated due to the eclipse, and immediately realizing, oh, there's going to be an influx of people, therefore that means that there'll be more opportunities for us to recruit people into our cult. It's openly exploitative, the approach they take to this event. They're not interested in helping the town. They're not interested in serving the community. They're interested in increasing their numbers. They're interested in roping people into their religion. But somehow they've convinced themselves that this is something that they can be proud of, and Watchtower's clearly proud of it because they've created this segment.
So in our campaign, we decided to feature 3 primary tools. First, what does the Bible really teach? Because many people wonder. Second, was life created? With an eclipse event, people are thinking about the universe. It's a good opportunity to talk about our Creator.
I don't quite follow the logic here. They're trying to figure out what propaganda materials to feature in this highly exploitative community outreach program they're arranging. The Bible Teach book, no-brainer. That's the book you have to study if you want to become a Jehovah's Witness. But let's also offer a brochure that tells people that we know better than scientists. We know that life didn't evolve, that humans in fact popped into existence 6,000 years ago in a garden with a talking snake. Trust us, we know because we've read the Bible. And this is precisely the sort of material that will appeal to people who are coming to a national park to observe a solar eclipse.
Some of the estimates that we have heard are conservative estimates of probably 200,000 visitors. It may be more than that.
The local congregations made themselves available to work with city officials to prepare the parks for the large influx of people.
So many of Jehovah's Witnesses have volunteered to help in all kinds of things.
These are really small communities that are having a very large influx of people. So all of that extra effort and help in kind of preparing and cleaning up is much appreciated.
So we've been working with Jehovah's Witnesses for a period of years here at Smith Rock. It's been a good experience for our staff and our volunteers, and we want to accommodate that in any way we can.
So first of all, it seems almost as though Watchtower is trying to convince us that they do work in the community. That seems to be the message here. Oh, we're not just interested in looking after our own, we're also willing to get stuck in and help local communities, do community outreach work. Again, this is a one-off situation where you see an opportunity to recruit people into your organization, and with the ulterior motive of serving that objective, you're sweetening the deal by doing some work for the local town officials and sprucing up the parks, etc. If it's done with an ulterior motive, I don't see it how it's something that you can be proud of. And I also find it regrettable for Scott Brown, the park manager at Smith Rock State Park, who's somehow been roped into participating in a cult propaganda video, clearly oblivious to the organization he's speaking up for here. He's speaking in favorable terms about an organization that breaks up families through shunning, covers up child sex abuse, and persuades people to die rather than accept blood transfusions. And he's talking about some kind of collaboration. Oh, we've been working for a number of years with the Jehovah's Witnesses. How have you been working with them, Scott Brown? I don't think you've really been working with them, have you? I think they've probably been coming to Smith Rock with their carts and trying to recruit visitors to Smith Rock into their cult. And I think you've let them. That's not working with them. That's them exploiting you and exploiting your park. So I think it's not going to age well, I don't think, for Scott Brown, particularly as the reputation of Jehovah's Witnesses worsens.
Paul spoke about his ministry. He said, "Woe is me if I did not declare the good news." So we don't want to look back and wish we would have done more.
Well, madam, it's interesting you should say that, because you won't be able to look back and wish you had done more, because according to a recent talk by Tony Morris, who is presenting this month's broadcast, if you don't do enough in the preaching work, you're going to die.
So you just take a look, and this is the idea Jehovah's getting across, at your hands. And you look at your hands now, only God, as he looks at your hands in here and all those that are tied in, does he see blood there? The humans sitting next to you, they might have an idea because they know you well and you haven't been out in service in weeks. Well, guess what? Most likely God's seeing some blood all over your hands. Or they go totally inactive, and we appeal to them, we try to help, but you cannot water down what God says here. If your hands are not clean because you've been out warning, then they have blood on them, and you're going to lose your life.
So it's not like you have a choice, is it? Oh, should I preach more, or should I just kind of take it easy and preach whenever I feel like it? That is not what you are taught as a Jehovah's Witness. You are literally taught that you are blood guilty if you don't preach to the extent that your circumstances will allow. If you don't put forth effort and do everything you can to preach, you yourself are worthy of death, because you are denying other people the opportunity to live forever in paradise. So I'm sorry, Watchtower, but nobody is buying your suggestion that there's anything optional about this.
And you're my friend, 'cause you're always there through our ups and downs and through all we've shared. And I'm there when you need someone, when things are hard to bear. I'll be the friend you need, you can count on me.
So that was this month's music video. Apologies for not preparing you for it. But yeah, witnesses are here being reminded of how wonderful friendship is in the organization, and not at all conditional on everybody agreeing with the teachings and thoughts and policies of a bunch of dudes in New York. To be honest, there are some music videos where I actually think they've done a good job with the music. It seems to be reasonably up to date and fresh and contemporary, at least as far as the technical, at least as far as the music is concerned. This music, I'm sorry, I would really struggle to imagine witnesses playing this in their homes or playing this in the car, just because of how bog standard the music itself is. I mean, this is elevator music, I'm sorry, just really bland, featureless music on which you have these lyrics that entirely misrepresent what the organization's all about. Yes, as a witness, you're going to buy into this, and you're going to think that the only place where you can find true friendship is in Jehovah's Witnesses. But the minute you get out, in fact, even before you get out, you realize what a fiction this is, because not just in my own case, but in case after case that I've heard from others, the shunning begins even before you've officially left. The shunning begins even before you're disfellowshipped or disassociated, because you are deemed to be bad association just by skipping meetings or just by not being frequent enough in the preaching work. That's how fickle friendship is among Jehovah's Witnesses, and yet they have the cheek to put out music videos like this talking about how wonderful and how meaningful friendship is among Jehovah's Witnesses. For me, it follows a pattern of entirely misrepresenting and exaggerating the benefits of the organization in Watchtower's propaganda. And another example is in the forthcoming, I know I'm deviating a little bit here, but in the forthcoming convention, we have the title there, Love Never Fails. Well, it will fail the instant you stop agreeing with Toni Morris and Jeffrey Jackson and Stephen Lett and Samuel Hurd. You'll find it quite instant how quickly this love shrivels up and evaporates, because you are only worthy as a person, as a human being, if you're following the organization, and not just following the organization, but doing everything you can to support the organization, using any opportunity. The organization is the solution to every problem, as we saw in this broadcast with the material about marriages, material that, again, is frankly irresponsible in telling people in potentially abusive relationships that they ought to stick it out no matter what, that they are responsible for, their spouse's spirituality and for recruiting their spouse into the organization. Yeah, this was a bad broadcast, I don't mind saying. And though I've covered worse broadcasts where I've just been blown away by some of the material, there's been plenty to talk about, so I'm sure you'll agree. But that's pretty much it for this month's JW Broadcasting Rebuttal. Please don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos, and as always, thank you for watching.